Vinay Patel is part of a younger generation than most of the playwrights I've interviewed for this series. I first became aware of him when his monologue True Brits was performed at the Volts Festival in 2015. And then the following year, when his devastating TV drama Murdered by My Father was broadcast on BBC One. In a way, that 1-2 was a great introduction to Vinay Patel. Both of them are terrific examples of storytelling, and Vinay reminds me in an odd way of James Graham, if only because they both have a kind of old-fashioned love of story. By old-fashioned, I don't mean their storytelling is old-fashioned or that they are in any way kind of conservative forces. Neither of those things I think are true, but they are, I think, excited by story, by character, by twists, by revelations, by anticipation, investing in a fictional world, the audience leaning in, wondering, being shocked, intrigued, delighted, horrified, in a way that I think probably a previous generation is perhaps nervous about or skeptical about and reluctant to engage in. And of course, I then also don't mean to imply that Vinay is in any sense naive about story. He's not, apart from being a terrific writer of drama. He's also an inveterate blogger and commentator on theatre and writing. His email newsletter, Patelegrams, is always worth a read. But of those two, True Brits is a monologue, but it's an ambitious monologue. Monologues are kind of often a way that playwrights start writing. It feels like something you can control a bit more than dialogue. But the ambition is felt in True Brits in a way that the speaker is so he's a young British Asian man, but the monologue cuts between 2005, the year of the London bombings, and 2012, which is the year of the London Olympics, and it takes us on a kind of journey of confusion and exploration about the place of a young Asian man or a young British Asian man trying to understand what Britain is and where he fits into it. And it's a play that evokes a personal mystery whose solution tells us about national and personal identity. And then Murdered by My Father is a kind of gripping, emotionally ringing drama about a so-called honor killing, which starts at an extraordinarily high pitch and then drives towards an ending that you can absolutely see coming. Hell, it's in the title, but it's no less devastating when it comes. And both of these dramas are serious, they're accessible, and they're gripping, and they're hugely confident in what they're doing. Both of them build out from story, from meaty stories, to ask really complex, interesting, tough questions about identity and nationhood and love. Both of these plays are about love. It's also, I think, rather typical of Vinay that while I'm describing, perhaps in a slightly forced way, what these two shows have in common, they're actually very different, of course, in form, in mode, in tone. And in fact, even in his, I guess, fairly small body of work so far, Vinay has continually surprised. If True Brits and Murdered led you to kind of pigeonhole him as a chronicler of the British Asian experience, not that that is particularly a pigeonhole or a role that somebody would want to resist, along comes Sticks and Stones, which is a sharp workplace satire, which is, I guess, about cancel culture, and it's about a workplace. It's about a work colleague who during an otherwise very successful, I think, kind of pitch meeting, he uses a controversial word, and the reaction of the colleagues and the management kind of spirals, and it spirals out of control until they lose their job and more. But he makes a couple of really interesting dramaturgical choices that deepens and complicates this very funny story, kind of funny and flinty and difficult story. First, brilliantly, we never hear what that word is. We just see the reaction to it. And as I say, the play is kind of hard-edged and it's flinty and it's funny and it's told in a series of very short, quite brutal scenes that reminds me of I don't know, of kind of like Mike Bartlett in plays like Contractions or Bull. Uh, and the other thing is it's got that kind of interesting post Martin Crimp thing where the characters are not really specified, or at least built up as characters. So Vinay isn't telling us who these people are that are being so offended by the language, which of course means that casting this play becomes a wickedly political thing. Payne's Plough, who first produced the play, I think didn't really take advantage of that potential. But I think it'd be really interesting to see further performances of this play with perhaps more diverse casting, where that can stir up further questions in a really interesting way. And then came, a couple of years ago, An Adventure, where Sticks and Stones is tight, punchy, ironic, linguistic. An Adventure is vast and panoramic, crossing decades and continents to tell its story about a woman in India in the 1950s falling in love with a wonderfully unsuitable guy who turns out to be the best thing in the world. And we go from India to Kenya and the Mau Mau to Britain in the 1970s, and then finally to now. So it's a history play and a love story and a play about colonialism, solidarity, choices, and yes, again, love. His plays, I think, up to that point, you could kind of describe as miniatures. They included things like 2014's Free Fall, which is a two-hander about a woman determined to take her life from a stranger, determined to change her mind. But An Adventure was epic. It was apparently based on the story of Vinay's own grandparents. But if anyone thought that it was, because it was sort of semi-autobiographical, it was therefore a kind of one-off in its scale and ambition, 2 months after An Adventure opened at the Bush, came his astonishing episode of Doctor Who, Demons of the Punjab. And I say this as a lifelong fan, this was one of the best Doctor Who stories I've ever seen. And it was just as vast and sweeping and complex and daring as An Adventure, a piece that threaded a sophisticated science fiction premise into a rich historical story. It was stunningly good. And then earlier this year, he wrote another episode, Fugitive of the Jadoon, that was packed with exhilarating shocks and revelations and delights, from the unexpected return of Captain Jack to our first glimpse of a black female Doctor Who. Vinay Patel is not just an observer of cultural debate and cultural clash, but he's a maker of it too. I kind of hope we don't lose Vinay to television, although he's equally adept at television as he is at theatre writing, because it feels to me that he's on a creative journey in theatre, a journey that in its way is kind of as vast and extraordinary as Jyoti and Rasic in An Adventure. He's also a really nice guy, which is just kind of just showing off at this point. Anyway, I can't wait to talk to him again, and here he is. So, Vinay, hello.
Hello.
How are you? How's lockdown?
Better now. Yeah, I think at the start it was a bit weird. I had this kind of symbolic moment where my birthday was on the 16th of March, which is also the day all the theatres shut down.
Oh, right.
So it was like this wave of euphoria at this joyful day, as well as all this horrible, horrible stuff happening at once. And I was sort of like riding that wave of confusion for about 3 weeks. And I did nothing. I reacquainted myself with my PS4 and some old friends that I haven't seen like since school. But then, yeah, I've had like a really productive couple of weeks, and hopefully that will continue so I can live. That'd be nice.
Yeah, indeed. Are you having that thing? I suppose because you write TV as well as theatre. Are you working on in both things at the moment, or?
Yeah, I'm working on three telly things at the moment, and one I've just handed in a draft of a play, and I'm about to start on a play which I'd sort of got like a few thousand words of in, but like really need to actually write the draft of. So yeah, dancing between the two.
Is there any part of you, I'm asking a couple of writers this, is there any part of you thinking what's difficult to write is not quite knowing what sort of world we're going to be writing for?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like in one sense, it's quite easy. So like one of the things I'm writing, I had like this flu pandemic storyline. I was like, let's just not do that. Like, you know, it's really difficult for some things you're writing to not seem like really on the nose and possibly a bit exploitative. So that's in that sense, that's easy. But I think it's kind of hard to judge. One, you're like never quite sure of the mood that people will be in. Like, I've seen a lot of talk saying, "Oh, all we'll ever want is like endless reruns of One Man, Two Governors." But like, you know, like one of the play that I've just finished, just handed a draft in on is like a Chekhov adaptation. I've been saying, actually, my problem with going to see a lot of Chekhov was that it's quite hard to get an understanding of that isolation and boredom in the modern world. But like, it's a lot easier now, and so I think there'll be certain works that, if they can tap into the feelings, you know, the variety of feelings that people have kind of experienced during this time, then that will be something people will be craving too. Maybe like not going, yes, let's definitely book for that, but it'll be something that, you know, they'll need in that artistic sense of we create work that we feel people need. So yeah, I wouldn't want to judge it too early on, really. I just try not to let that get into my head too much and just write what I'm writing.
Yeah. That's very interesting. It hadn't occurred to me at all that Chekhov might indeed be almost the playwright for the pandemic.
I mean, in a way, that's a very selfish wish on my part. But yeah, no, it was funny going through it, and you know, you're writing. It is funny, like sometimes you read through his work and like just go to Moscow, just do it, and then you realize, oh no, wait, you know, you get a sense of what it truly means to not have that option available to you.
So what I'd like to do, if this makes sense to your work, is to kind of start by thinking quite generally about the ways you tend to develop plays and come up with plays and write plays and so on. And then at the end, maybe we'll look at something a bit more specific. But I suppose it's the obvious first question, which is kind of, typically, where do your plays start? And by that, I kind of mean, do they start with an image, or do they start with a story idea or a formal idea or something else?
Yeah, like it comes from all over, really. Like, weirdly, some of like my earliest works came from like little essays I used to write. Like I have a a blog where I write sort of like these little think pieces, and for a while that used to be a place where I organized my thoughts. And I think I got to a place where if I'd done a couple of those on the same topic, it was something that stuck in my head. And I guess, you know, like the casual equivalence of that is like, what's that thing that you can't stop talking about when you're down the pub with your mates and they're like really tired of hearing about? Like in that sense, that's driven a lot of the stuff I'm interested in. I think as I've got deeper into my career and become a bit more aware of the things that drive me, I find the idea of trying to create a really attractive and big role for people, I find that really interesting. Like, so character psychology is definitely something that drives me into creating something, but also just that really basic thing of, oh, what's a thing I'd love to see exist? I think, you know, that's kind of where you are when you start off. And then what happens is, you know, to make it as a writer, you do a lot of work for hire, and that instinct gets blunted a little bit, but I've tried to embrace that more fully now. It's like, what's just that thing that I would make for myself that I feel like I'd really need right now? But yeah, like mostly it's either the thing that gets stuck in my head, so something that compels me, or it's a person I just really want to see exist. And that's particularly with theatre, you know, it's like, I just want to, the lovely thing about like I've said this elsewhere, but the thing about roles is that they outlive you as a writer. And you get, you know, that can be someone's way into the industry, like not just reading a text going, God, I really want to be that person for an hour and a half, and that feels quite magical. So the idea of sort of gifting this sort of symbiotic creature that people can come into feels really exciting to me.
That's really interesting because in a sense they're two quite different sources. One being a sort of a set of, I don't know, social, cultural, political, whatever it is, preoccupations, which I guess is kind of thematic.
Yep.
And then there's a sort of kind of formal thing of creating a great character and wanting to bring that person into existence. Or would it be that sometimes it's about the smashing together of those two things that makes a play?
Yeah, I think inevitably those two like I think, you know, any sort of, not just any artist, but any sort of person have different drives that affect every decision they make. And I think when you spend a long time with a decision, which is to create a piece of work, inevitably you'll get those layerings of different instincts on top of it.
Yeah.
And depending on how you're feeling, one will be driving over the other, depending where you are on the process. But yeah, I think for me, I know an idea is good if it can sort of draw on those two places. It's something that has that sociological aspect, but also, you know, which is like the kind of more that gut feel of what I want, and then something that keeps me thinking. If I can smash those two things together, then definitely I know that I'm onto something, because it just takes so long to make something.
Yeah.
That if it's just satisfying one part of yourself, I think that's really difficult to stick with.
And I mean, let's kind of imagine you've come up with an idea for a play, and let's say you've got the preoccupation, but you've started to think, I can sort of see how this might become play shaped, rather than just talk down the pub.
Yeah.
Talk down the pub, I say, in a nostalgic
I've got those and years of old, yeah.
But what would you typically do next? Do you kind of go, I'm going to hit some research? Am I going to read some other plays in this sort of area? Walk around, keep a notebook?
Yeah. I think every time I've tried to formalize a process, I've like completely fucked it up. Like I have so many like 1/3 full notebooks from every project going, yes, this will be the way I do this now. I write one notebook, but inevitably just the way like inspiration strikes you, it's more like what you have at hand. So there's like I went through one formal process of like, I'll write lots of stuff in my phone, like on my notes, and then make sure at the end of every week or the end of every day, I'll sit down, go through those notes and write them up formally into whatever project file or what they're meant to be. But usually I won't jump straight into the research. More often than not, I'll try and throw out a couple of scenes, or at least little bits of scenes that aren't necessarily act one, scene one, just all over the place, to get a sense of what sort of play it kind of wants to be. And whether it'll be like, that's really serious, or that's really funny, or that's going to be quite a straight narrative, or does it have a kind of meta element to it? Like I use that to kind of feel out the texture of the work in the first instance. And then once I feel like I've run out of that a little bit, then I'll try and do something a bit more formal, and that will either be delving into research more fully, or since I've gone into television, like and film, they've like outlined so much more, and so that becomes part of that process. Go, okay, maybe this is the way to think about it. Just trying to plot out maybe 10 beats and put a rough story shape on it, so you can fling all that random stuff towards it, and it will cohere into sort of Frankenstein's monster of an idea. But I think when I first started writing stuff, I think when I'd had an idea, I'd go, oh, this is really great. I can't wait to see how it's going to be completely different when I'm finished. And I thought that part of being more disciplined would be you're better at fulfilling that initial idea and bringing that through to the final place. But actually, it's always a wild ride every time. Maybe that's just me not being very good. But I can't lead it too hard. But there are, once I've done that first bit of research, that will probably be trying to look at other plays I feel like it probably is a bit like, but that can lead to you like a wild draft where, like I remember I did a draft of one play that ended up being this complete nutty surrealist fantasy, and I remember handing that in and everyone's like, that's really, can we just like make it like a normal good play? You're like, right, yes. But you had to go through that version to get there. So yeah, I think I feel around it a lot before coming into the center of it.
And can I pick up on a phrase you used there, which I think I've remembered it right. Was it like 1 minute ago? You said something like you don't lead it too hard, I think you said.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I think maybe it's just because I'm not a person who's like super certain what they think about a thing. So I don't find it very useful to go, this is definitely what I want to say and I want to drive this towards it. Usually it'll be, I kind of feel this about that, or I'm not sure how I feel about this, and I'd like to poke away at the edges of that. And that's what I mean by, I'm not trying to, more often than not, go, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to drive everything towards this. I'm just not that certain as a person. So it's just a lot of like feeling around the edges, and it does fill itself in. I do get more, the later drafts, particularly when you're more certain of what it is, then obviously you can be that rigorous, you can be that thorough and ruthless. But yeah, at the start, I'm never, well, not yet, I've never been, yep, this is exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to head straight towards that.
And you mentioned sometimes making notes in a notebook, sometimes on your phone. What kind of notes might they be?
It'll either be like a snippet of dialogue. It'll be something I've read while I'm procrastinating, something I heard on a bus. Again, those things that you may have heard of. It might just be like a very pretentious thought that I've had that I totally believe is true, but I kind of don't want to admit that I've had it. So that goes in there, and I'll try and find a way to bring that into a character's mouth and disown it a little bit, but still be able to claim it. Yeah, it's always different snippets of a thing. But I find that the more, a play is going well when you just get those little grab bags of everything, and like suddenly everything that you look at has some sort of bearing on what you're writing.
Yeah.
And that's the bit where I'm like taking tons and tons of notes. Like, oh yeah, of course, that should go there. Or yes, that song. Or oh, that name. Or that image. It's that's most of what ends up in that little notebook.
And the kind of the method you describe, which actually is very similar to what quite a few other playwrights have described, a quite organic kind of process that may even feel slightly haphazard in some ways, but it still roughly is tending towards a play. I can totally get that in terms of how characters will develop and how dialogue will emerge and so on. But the form of the play feels like something that there must surely be a point where you kind of go, actually, this is the form of it. And now I have to reorganize what I did in the past, and it's going to organize what I do in the future. Or is that not right?
Yeah, no, that's usually that'll come quite late in the day. I'll only push form more heavily if I've got quite a short span of time. So whether that's like a telly project, and I was like, right, it's going to be in like 4 acts with a teaser, or a play I did a couple of years back. I think it got commissioned in like November, and it was on in June, and I was like, oh crap. So that was like, that's when you lean back on the stuff that you kind of know and have learned, like a 5-act structure, and go, I'm going to start from the structure, because I don't really have time to do my usual process. But more often than not, I think, again, when I started, especially as I went and did an MA, so I had some training in writing, I would try and, it was about trying to organize that random stuff towards what I understood was like the right structure for a narrative. But now, especially with my theatre work, I've got better at going, what is the structure that this piece wants to be, and what's the most effective execution of the things I want an audience to feel via the structure, which sounds slightly pretentious, but it is just, and ideally it's a thing an audience never picks up on, but it's something you have thought about a lot. But yeah, I find that comes to me later and later, but it's much more certain.
And so, and tell me if this is wrong as a way I'm going to characterize what this process is like. It sounds like, there's this very organic process. You will be writing bits of dialogue, but they may not really sort of quite amount to scenes as such. So that after a period of some months, you've got a big kind of grab bag of resources and materials. Would it be right then to say, and then there comes a point where you think, I can now write it? Or do you feel like you've already been writing it and you're just assembling it?
It's a bit of both. Like when you assemble it, it'll never be quite right. You'll probably have to. I think when I was starting out, I'd be like, I put it together. Thank God it's done. But I've got more rigorous and truer to making process more fully reflect my intentions. So I'll take that grab bag, I'll slap it into a vague shape just so I don't feel like, I think you can get really overwhelmed, especially if you're writing something quite big and you just have files and files and files of things. And part of the act of saving yourself is to try and organize it slightly. But then more often than not, that assembly will reveal either we haven't quite thought through some things, it reveals some indulgence maybe that you, because if you're just starting out with snippets of dialogue, like dialogue's always the easy and the fun part, at least for me. There'll be variants of tone all over the place, but what's good about that shaping, and more often than not, you're probably kind of just starting again, but knowing what you put together in your head is knowing what you don't want something to be is kind of what that process is more about for me. Going, oh, that doesn't quite feel right, and that will lead you to it. Maybe something else that you've written is probably closer to reflecting of it. And then from there, it is this weird mix, I guess, of you are formalizing what you've done, but you are also being guided by that instinctual feel to what you don't want.
Yeah. So is there a point where you, I mean, is it a literal assembly? I mean, would you actually be cutting and pasting stuff and creating a document? Or is it that you're writing and incorporating stuff as you go?
My slightly terrible method for constructing a play is once I have like a scratch file, right, in which I've got like every amazing witty line of thought I have, like it's super, super long. And then I'll start assembling various dots. So I use a program called Scrivener.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's a thing where you can write separate scenes, but then it compiles it all together. And I find, for me, as someone who doesn't write in a linear fashion, that's like an absolute godsend. It means I can just sort of jump into a bit without thinking about the rest of the play, and then just work that through.
Right.
So I'll slowly build the scenes in separate little documents, and it'll pull it all together. And then I'll go through that scratch document and go, I think this is probably that scene, or that's a thought that belongs there. So I'll literally empty out that scratch document and build it into where I roughly think it is. And then some things I'll go, that's a piece of shit, lose that. Or like I'll go, maybe later. And at the very end of the process, or, when I'm handing in a draft, I might like dip back in there, see if there's anything orphaned. And more often than not, it's like, oh, the play isn't that anymore, or I don't need that, or that's just me trying to be too clever. I don't need to jam that in there. But I think when I was younger, I would have gone like, this is like the most amazing thought anyone has. I've got to jam that in someone's mouth. But now I'm much better at going, no, that play isn't that anymore. It's fine, get rid of it. But it's just, it's a good place to find all that orphan stuff. But yeah, I'll organize it from that one massive little document into little. I also like try and build a little guiding document. Which is a thing that simply states like what I think, a question at the top saying, this is what I think the question I'm trying to answer with this play is. I'll like write a little bit about themes there, maybe a couple of songs that I think are part of the feeling. And just like, that's mostly the tonal stuff, or the stuff from the outside rather than the stuff that's coming from the drama that I think that I want it to be. And then every now and then, if I'm feeling a bit lost, I'll check in on that, especially that question. And I'll go, is that still what this is? And if it's not, I'll adjust it, just so I can have some consistency. Because when you're jumping between lots of different projects, it can be quite hard to zero yourself back into another one. So I find that quite a handy little thing to me. And I deliberately make sure that's not very long. Like that's like a couple of pages max. It's something that I can sit down with, absorb, and then go back into the document again.
And in the kind of period, I mean, I think it's a bit blurred, the distinction I'm doggedly sticking to. But let's say in the kind of writing bit, rather than the accumulating of ideas phase, in the writing bit, are you quite disciplined? Do you have kind of a regular habit? Is it quite intense or not?
Yeah, it's gotten to be that. Again, I think just writing for telly, just because the timelines are usually a bit shorter, or you'll have to turn around drafts so much quickly. I've got much better at just going, and now I'm doing the writing, and that has definitely impacted the way I write theatre. Yeah, I will try and I will something I brought from a show I worked on is this concept of open time and closed time, not in terms of the timescale of a play, but in terms of open thoughts. So when you're going, you can throw absolutely anything at the wall and go, here's a great idea, here's a great idea, here's a great idea, like, or just riffing on it. And then closed is when you're like, I literally cannot add anything else to this. I need to make what I have here good. And I try and make sure I flip between those two. So you have that release of just going, I just need to like throw some mad stuff at this, but also just having the discipline of going, and now you don't get to do that anymore. Here's what you put down here. Shape this into the best scene or the best segment or the best character by it, whatever you're writing at the time, and make that the thing.
When you're writing, and this is a bit of a what's going on in Vinay Patel's head question, are you imagining the characters as real people in a real situation, or actors speaking the lines on stage?
It's real people in a real situation, I think. Yeah, more often than not. I think that might just be because, I grew up watching like telly and film. Like I didn't really see any theatre until I was an adult. So my dramatic imagination sort of sits there, and also just when I was younger, I wanted to be, and still one day will be, like directing film and telly and whatnot. So I think I always am trying to think in the visual terms more than anything. I do eventually, once I get into a rehearsal room, or once I know the space in which the play is sitting, then my brain does do this kind of flip to seeing it with actors, especially if I know who they are in the space. Mm-hmm. But till then, I sort of see the full thing. I guess that's because you also get a sense of the mood of the piece, and before like a designer or a director has been able to come in and do that for you. And I find it easier to kind of give the indication of what I want this moment to feel like, especially in stage directions, if I can kind of see it in one sense, and then I'm happy for that all to be thrown out or be reconceived. But just for me to give an idea of what I think that moment feels like, I find that much easier to see that as quite literal in the first instance.
Right. And really going into the nuts and bolts here, you're typing, yeah? You said it's Scrivener, so it's typing, not handwriting.
Yeah, I type. I have when I'm stuck, I'll like do some longhand writing, like not really dialogue or anything apart from like little scraps of it, but just having. I find it easier to have long flows of thought that bring in lots of other thoughts when it's by hand. Right. So I'll have like an A4 notebook. I used to have like a smaller one, but there's something about this sort of like a thing I've just tricked myself into, having 2 A4 sheets and going, wow, this idea could be as big as you want it to be. Rather, I find like when I have a smaller notebook, I'm a little bit more granular. I don't know why. So I try to have like an A4, but also now I've switched to ones, instead of having ones that are lovely hardback bound, which I can keep somewhere and look back on, I realize I get really freaked out trying to write those. Like, man, I need my writing to be as good as like the binding on this thing. So I've reverted to like very cheap A4, like ring binder, like pull out paper, and that's been great actually. But yeah, all my I don't write plays on hand. Like I wish my handwriting was good enough for it, but I just it's all typing.
That's interesting. Ali McDowell does the same thing, getting cheap exercise books to write in. Yeah. It cheats you into thinking this doesn't have to be a big.
It does help, and you know what? Weirdly, that's kind of, in another way, that's kind of how lockdown has kind of affected the process a little bit, because we've gone from managing to make this really good because someone important's going to look at it, to maybe this will never happen. And which has again has that freeing effect, and it brings you back to when you were just sort of doing it for the love of it, going, if I can just write whatever I want, I can do that, because any budgetary considerations are long way. I was saying to my friend that I've literally got to that point where I was watching For All Mankind, which is like this alt history version of the space race. And my idea of what a big budget is, I just saw this like room that had like 25 people, and it was like, how much does that cost? All those people, that costs so much money, as opposed to like the spaceship or whatnot. Whereas now I'm like, I'm writing all the people I want, and that's quite glorious and freeing. So yeah, I guess the exercise book thing, yeah, helps, just because I find typing quite precious in a way. I feel like I'm really, I've got better at deleting stuff than I used to be, but I do find it feels quite formal. Whereas yeah, having my slightly childish handwriting means the ideas themselves are all quite childlike.
Right. And when you are typing, font, what is your font choice?
So I watched the James Graham interview you did, and I was like astonished to hear that Baskerville is the Matthew font, because I also do a similar sort of trick, but mine's with Times New Roman, where I try to lay it out exactly what it will be, or what I think it will look like in the published playtext.
Right.
Just again, so I'm tricking myself and going to make it good, like earn that and that print run.
Right.
But it can, like, it, funny enough, like that can sort of depend. If I'm writing something a little bit more playful, I find it somehow easier to go stick everything in Arial, because I was like, this isn't a real play. You can just do whatever you want, and then eventually it'll come back around. But yeah, like when I'm doing like my adaptation, I'm like, Chekhov is Times New Roman, man. I'm going with that.
Right. Yeah, of course.
And then yeah, and then and then screenplays is just all choreo.
Of course, yeah. And what about rewriting? And I ask this sort of in the context of the fact that I think rewriting is often a skill that comes later than being able to write, sort of thing. How do you approach rewriting? What do you do in the process? How do you get over the terrible sadness that it wasn't perfect first time? Those sorts of things.
So now, okay, as soon as I send something in, I'll allow myself more time to feel like that was like my most favorite, best thing ever. Because I realized if I didn't celebrate that moment, it sort of didn't register as like I'd done it, and it didn't. But then when I got the notes back, I'd be like, well, we're back on the, we're just back on the hamster wheel. So actually, I tried to get better at celebrating those hand-ins. But then when it comes to rewriting itself, if it's someone else giving me notes, then I'll sort of collate them into a simple document, removing any sort of like that shit sandwich compliment thing. It's like, yeah, this is really great. It's like, don't need that. That's fine. Just break it down to what's actually being asked for in a sort of bullet point way. And then I'll print them out, and I'll just have it very cleanly on the side of my document and I'll read through it. If I have a chance, I'll not come back to it for a few days, just so I can have read it, understood it. Because I think if you try and apply the notes straight away, either two things will happen. One, you'll implement a note that isn't necessarily right, or you'll have this horrible reaction going, they're completely wrong, and I'm not going to do that at all. I'm not even going to think about it. And actually, I try and be neutral. If you trust your collaborators, I try and be a little bit more neutral on that and just go, okay, you're very close emotionally to what you've just handed in. This is what it reads like to someone who isn't you, and that is really important. So I'll come back to it after a few days, work on something else. And then I'll very slowly go, okay, today I'm going to tackle this note, if it's like quite a big, either a structural one or a big character note, or I'll just do a run of smaller ones together. But yeah, it's quite methodical, I guess. But if it's my own, then that'll be a sort of similar thing to the writing, where I'll just have a grab bag of notes in a file on my phone going, oh, I actually did that, or it's a shame I didn't have that, or actually, yeah, I think this will be a thing that brings this out more fully. And I'll try and wait until I've got a good number of those, rather than, again, not implementing it straight away, just sort of seeing how they sit alongside the other ideas I have. And because then I feel like your rewrite has some degree of purposefulness. It's not just tinkering. Like, you can tinker all the time, that's fine. Yeah. But like, for the draft to be a proper draft, I think you need to know what it is. that you want to change? Because if you're still in the place of, well, actually I quite like what I did before, you're never going to do a good job. You have to really feel and understand the need for why that thing needs to shift, which is why like my thing, when I was saying about the notes that you disagree with, like almost 100% of the time I will come back and go, they're totally right. But the reason I was rejecting it was because I needed to believe that what I'd done before was good. Otherwise I'd just never be able to write a draft again. But then that gives you that emotional distance to go, that's not like the most wonderful thing in the world. That is just a draft, and you can my cat has come into the room, so he might appear at some point. But yeah.
And is that process of kind of taking notes, do you experience that as being different in TV and film on one side and theatre on the other?
I think they've gotten a lot more similar, you know.
Right.
I mean, all right. So I don't know if you had that. But like in that, you know, it's you hand in a thing, someone will write up a list of things that they think are wrong with it. They'll give you a phone call if you're lucky, and it gets sent over to you, and you just work through it. It's very different, obviously, when you're in rehearsal. Those kind of notes are a bit more. It's feel like you're all playing in the guts of the thing itself, and that's those kind of notes are a bit more exciting. Again, harder to push away because your emotions all over the place. But yeah, I mean, there's not. In my experience, there's not been a huge amount of difference in terms of telly, except for obviously in telly, you'll have notes from 7 different people and their mums, and you have to go, there's a lot more discerning what are the notes to really follow, I think, in telly, depending on the project, obviously, and it feels like there's a lot more battles there, whereas I think in theatre, you're more likely to have chosen a lot of your collaborators or had a hand in choosing who they are. And there's still more of a centrality of writers to theatre. So, yeah, I've been lucky actually. With most people I've worked with have been quite insightful. But yeah, I think the only difference really has just been the amount and the filtering.
And you kind of mentioned that kind of more often than not, the notes, once you've sort of given them a few days to percolate, you can kind of see that there is something in it. What do you do if after those few days that you really, really don't think the note is right? Do you confront the person, or not confront? Do you just say up front, this one I'm not going to do, but I am going to do the others? Or do you say, can you tell me more about it? Or do you try and do the rewrite anyway?
So I think, when I first started out, I was very bad at defending my own work. So I'd just be like, even if it was just hearing an actor say a line and didn't quite land right, I was like, oh, that's terrible, let's get rid of it. So I think when I first started, I'd be just going, oh, they're right, I'll just do it. And then what happens is you'll have a piece of work that either gets shot or put up, and it will be so horrific to you to see what has happened there that you'll be like, having that awkward conversation where you kind of push back on something is way better than having to see this again and again and again, like being tormented by your own lack of courage. So I've got much better now. I'll do too, like I'll look at it, I'll take that time away. If I'm still bumping on it, I'll have a first conversation with them where I'll go, I feel like this about it, but I'll try it. And I won't make that, I know some people, friends of friends, no one I know directly, obviously, who'll kind of like do a slightly shitty pass of that note to try and talk that person out of it. But I've gotten much better at trying to take it in good faith and implement it in the way that I think they're trying to make the project better with it. And if after that, like more often than not, actually, I'll go through it and go, maybe that's not like exactly right, but there's something to that. Because there's that, there's that adage of the thing they're trying, you're looking for the note behind the note. The thing they've told you isn't necessarily exactly what you need to fix, but they're bumping on something, and you've got to try and figure that out. And if I've tried it and I still haven't got it there, I will go and have that conversation. And what it might come down to is the fact that you have 2 fundamentally different ideas of a moment or a character or the whole piece. And then it becomes on you agreeing on who's you're going to kind of take through. But like that is so rarely the case. And the times that I found that like I've got much better at fighting for things that really matter. And if I feel like if I don't fight every single note, what happens is more often than not, if you have one thing that you definitely like, no, I just want to keep that, people are much more willing to let you go with it because you've been so amenable to everything else.
And can I ask you about writer's block? Have you ever had it?
In the sense that I get massive anxiety about writing things. Like I think it comes from different places. So like with something like Murdered by My Father or like a Doctor Who episode about partition, you're like, oh shit, like I've got to do this topic like really well, or like I've let down so many people who need this to be good or insightful. And so in that sense, there's that block that comes from responsibility, which is quite difficult to shift. But you just have to like dig away at it and go, look, it's not your job to represent absolutely everything. You just got to do a truthful and as responsible a job as you possibly can. And then there's stuff that comes from, I don't really know what that is yet. So as a TV project that I was working on where they gave me the commission to scrape the script, which is brilliant. And I started writing it and I was like, oh no, wait, I have no idea what this is. Can we actually go back and create a story document for this thing? Because, hey buddy, just because I feel like I don't know this world. And if I don't know this world, then here it is, sorry. He just likes people's voices.
Oh, well.
If I don't know this world, then I don't feel like I can write the characters or at least not do it in a clumsy way. So it might be a case of I've hit writing too early. I need to do more exploratory work. And sometimes it's just, I just can't be bothered. Like, this is just a hard bit of the story. Like, it's like in the middle of, the traditional act 2, or this is the bit where I'm laying in all the plot dynamic stuff and it's absolute donkey work, but you absolutely have to do it. And then that's just a case of experience and discipline and just going, oh, just like sit down, write a sentence, work on it for 20 minutes. But I've got much better at, I used to like be more blocked when I was younger, I think. And now it's just a case of, if I've got to a place where I'm writing something, I definitely have enough ideas. I just need to put my ass in the chair, really.
Right. And we've kind of talked a little bit about this already, but I want to talk a bit more, which is the fact that you've done telly and you've done the theatre. And I wondered whether the processes for you of writing feel very different, and whether you've learnt one from the other, whether you've applied lessons from each to the other.
Yeah, so I've said elsewhere that like nothing makes you want to write for theatre more than writing for telly, because it's such a machine, and the stuff you write for them more often than not will have to be these real plot beasts. Like, it just churns up like nobody's business. So to write this sort of like playful, ephemeral, slight thing is really difficult to do. Like, you're more likely to be able to get away with it now, but like if you're starting off, especially if you're writing on someone else's show, like, forget about it. And I think that when I first started writing for theatre, I had a very televisual sensibility, like I think a lot of newer writers do, because more people encounter telly than anything else, and it's where they shape their instinct for drama. So when I first started out, all my theatre was quite televisual, and now, having done lots of television, I try and go, what is the thing that earns this piece's place on a stage? What are those uniquely theatrical stuff? I think I've got more confident with being more playful and theatrical, having both experienced more work that does that, but also feeling like confident enough to break out of the literal. Like, the literal feels quite safe. It feels like a place if you don't feel like the most creative person in the world, you can at least work really hard and work through a character and work through a plot, and that's fine. Whereas I feel a little bit more confidence now to go, I'm just going to write this, and that's going to be the director's problem to figure out what that is, but it is an expression of what I feel. So yeah, my telly work has influenced I think my theatre writing process has made it more rigorous. Maybe not for the best, but it's also made the expansiveness of my theatre thinking much bigger. So I'm grateful for that. And then also just like sometimes it is nice to just sit down with a piece of script and go, I don't need to pour everything about myself. I don't have to scrape the inside of my brains to put my blood on the page, etc. To write this, I can just, work out a knotty little puzzle. And so you can satisfy different parts of yourself again.
And I mean, one thing that I think is probably less different about TV and stage than it used to be, but that certainly it used to be with film and TV, there'd be a quite prescriptive formula for how you're supposed to structure a story, which is much freer, or used to be much freer in theatre. And actually, I think telly's loosened up quite a lot, and actually you hear the language of that in theatre more. But how do you navigate things like the beat sheet, or the 3-act structure, or the inciting incident, and third act jeopardy, and all the sort of things you get thrown at a little bit in some kind of TV?
I remember I was working on something and they literally sent me a copy of like Sid Field's Save the Cat. I was so angry. I was like, we were talking about building characters, but literally looking at like archetypes and going, oh, we should make this. And I was so frustrated by that, because I think I'd maybe just because it's sort of been indulged a little bit, weirdly, like both being in theatre and like Murdered by My Father, which is my first gig for telly, I had like pretty free reign over that. Like it was really unusual, like, partly because it's a single drama, but also I was on the project before any director was attached, and they said I could, make it whatever I want. And so that I could have whatever structure I kind of wanted it to have. Whereas, yeah, I just, I found something like a 5-act structure quite useful.
Okay.
Because it's more granular than I think a 3-act thing is quite useless, except for the sense of beginning, middle, and end, which is always useful. But I find that those templates aren't particularly, they're not useful as a way of finding the fullest expression of what a project can be, right? So, and the more you read about structure and like acts in particular, the more you realize how much of the analysis of it is forcing a film to validate a theory that doesn't quite hold. Whereas if you look at things more deep, like I remember reading this amazing piece about how Malcolm X, the film, is like a 9-act film, and an act break is, a moment where that person's life changes completely and there's no going back. And when you have a biography piece, then that can be, having that sort of episodic structure to it makes sense of the person's life. It means you can go, oh yeah, rather than going, I need to find the midpoint of the life and the ending. It's like, that's not really the truth of, well, either, of the person, but also what that film is trying to do. So I think I've now brought myself around to, there are certain things like telly where having a certain shape, you get a sense of how that works, especially it's quite addictive, I think, the storytelling in telly that has a very, again, it's very comforting, it's a very purposeful, it's a very known thing. But I think if you are trying to tell something that is like in its fullest expression, you probably will go, oh, I will find a structure that eventually makes more sense for this. So like, I mean, as a play I did at the Bush a couple of years ago called Adventure, and that was like, I remember very clearly there was a moment where it's a triptych, so there's like 3 parts to it, but not quite, but yeah, and I remember going, oh yeah, I want this to reflect what a life feels like. So the opening act when they're young will be like 9 very relatively quick scenes, or it'll meander a little bit. The middle bit will be a bit more ticking along and 6 scenes, but sort of representing that way that the middle of your life kind of requires a certain rhythm to it. And then the last bit will be 3 quite long scenes that reflect my feeling of what that old age and that those characters heading towards a certain end of their life feels like. And those are all structural decisions that aren't right, as it, in terms of templates, but are right for the project. So yeah, I think like a bit, like James was saying in the interview, I think there is a case for starting with something like that, especially if you're uncertain. You just need to, like, the play I'm writing now is very definitely in a 5-act structure. but I also suspect it won't end up that way. So this is a very long way of me saying it's good to know so you can break the rules, which is what everyone says anyway. But I think you just have your own rebellion against it, and at some points that's childish, and at other points it's exactly what you need to do.
Thank you. I think that is actually that was fascinating. Can I actually pick up on an adventure actually? Just because it felt like a big sort of gear up in your writing, in the sense it was a more ambitious play, a bigger landscape, much longer time span than anything else. What were the kind of discoveries about your own writing that you kind of made in the process of making that play work?
So I think what happens is like the very, very first play I wrote was on my MA. Like I came into that MA thinking I was going to write a film, and ended up writing a play. And that play was like, again, it was massive. It had like 9 characters. It was huge. It also was like these 3 very big acts and huge time jumps and sets. That would have been a nightmare because I didn't know what theatre was. And then the next play I wrote was like a one-man play,
right.
Because I didn't understand what the chances of getting something like that on are like quite slim. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is you can easily lose the ambition or even the muscle to write something bigger. And so you kind of shrink yourself down into monologues or 2-handers or 3-handers, which is like absolutely fine. And I've like written plenty of those, and I will do more in the future. But I think for me, that play, the most important thing that happened in that play was me having one of my early meetings with Madney, and he was like, "Don't shrink this into a 2-hander that's 90 minutes long. Like, go for the big version." Like, and it's like, it's the push big. So I think John Gilchrist, who was the exec at the time, says you can either have like lots of people or it can be long. It can't be both. So like, pick the one that you want. And I was like, oh, the thing I kind of the politics of the play will not just be what it's talking about. It'll be the form going, I want people like this to take up 3 hours of an audience's time.
Exactly.
I don't want this just to be like a play at the Almeida that'll be 3 hours long and it could be about anything, right? It's like, I go, actually, this is a massive life. They live through so many different interesting things, and it's completely wild. The only way to really give a fullest expression of that is not to try and compress it into a sort of easily digestible anthropological 90 minutes. It was like, oh, I learned about that thing, and go home. So I really want to take up this time, because that's the only way I feel I can get a sense of feeling in the evolution of this couple's life together through to an audience. So in that sense, which is a challenge because I've never written in that mode before, but also it felt weirdly, it was a political act for myself to try and push my work in that direction, to claim that space and to kind of demand those resources of those characters as well as an audience. And feeling brave enough to do that took a long time to get my head around. And then you go completely overboard. Like my first draft of it was like 4.5 hours or something. So I think like Madney, having done that really big, proclamation, was like, yeah, not that big. Like definitely put it in. And obviously for the best of it, it was better for the play. But yeah, then it also, it's that hard, like rewriting something that's big is so difficult, because you'll change something super early on, but for that change to be meaningful, you have to track it across the whole thing, and you'll just discover drafts and drafts later, it's like, oh, I adjusted that, but I didn't pick up on how that's adjusted, and it's an absolute nightmare. And then it becomes more of an engineering project in a way, which I loved, but it was like, I remember I was rewriting that at the same time I was working a play for Payne's Plough, as well as completely writing from scratch an episode of Doctor Who. So it was like, God, I wish I just had the time to just sit with this and do nothing else. But yeah, it was a lesson in like craft and in sculpting a piece, but also just in being brave enough to make it the big thing that you want it to be, and to go, yeah, I want to claim that space.
So let me ask about what I think is that Payne's Plough exercise, which, as you know from our email conversation, I kind of picked as the play I want to talk about, partly because it's so unlike the other plays of yours, and but also I really love it. I think it's fantastically funny and very clever, but mostly it's really funny, and it's a very funny play. Is this also the play that you described earlier as being, you started writing it in November because it was on in...
yeah, it was really quick, yeah.
Because it feels like a play that was written in a kind of burst of energy.
Yeah.
Maybe just, where did this start as a play?
So that was one of those conversations you have in the pub all the time that I couldn't quite get out of my head. And it was that feeling that one of the big struggles that we're having as a society is a very profound communications failure, and that is how you get a depth of polarization. I think I was frustrated with a sense of being part of a tribe that I felt was very right and truthful, and its mission is very moral and right, but frustrated that the communication of those ideas were really bad. And part of that, I think, was the way, not just the world, but in particular language moves so fast, and it evolves so much faster within a tribe than it does throughout the rest of society. And eventually what happens is the discourse gets so far beyond that it's harder to pull people along with you. So I was thinking very heavily of like, how do I explain everything, things that I'm not even sure. Someone who spends a lot of time online is very heavily in my head in the discourse of progressive politics. But even I'm not entirely sure about what everything is. How the hell do I go to my dad, who's like working 80 hours a week and doesn't care about any of that stuff inherently, and go, by the way, this is the exact way in which to talk about this subject? Because either they won't be able to quite wrap their head around it, or they'll just reject it. And they'll go, well, I never asked for that. And I found that quite difficult, because I believe in those things very strongly. But I also realized the failure is reaching a hand back and bringing people along with us. And so I wanted something that talked about that. But what was great about it was interesting to have a commission where you're aware of the space that you're writing for straight away. And what I loved about Roundabout was it's just this, it's sort of this energy vortex. Like it responds to that quickness and that mania, and they can put it absolutely anywhere. So I like the idea of like, if I could write a play that discusses those things, but you can put it in front of an audience that might not care about theatre at all, doesn't care about anything I care about at all, how do I make this both reflect possibly some of their experience, but also make it fun to sit with, but also not demeaning to anyone? Like, how do I let in different points of view onto that topic in a way that feels fun, but also kind of holds their hand a little bit? So that's what I was trying to do with that. It was like, it was very intense.
And maybe I should say, in case there are people who are watching it who don't know what the Roundabout is, it's kind of Payne's Plough's sort of flat pack theatre, isn't it? Which they can put up in any large space. It's a theatre in the round, so you're sitting right round the action. And it's funny, because I was thinking when I was rereading this play that it's actually got a similar energy, I think, to Lungs by Duncan Macmillan, which was the first play I think I ever saw in that roundabout space. And it partly, I think it's that really interesting thing of you kind of invent from nothing. It has to completely live on its own, almost sort of slightly severed from a sense of context, even though clearly you're talking about things that are going on in the culture. You said it was a commission from Payne's Plough. Did you always know it was 3 actors?
Yes. Did I know it was 3 actors? Well, yeah, we knew it was 3 actors. Like, we can have as many parts as we want, but the idea was that you'd have 3 actors in rep on 3 different plays. So that we knew. But where that place came from was just, I should explain what the play is, sorry, really quickly. So it's kind of a kind of dark workplace comedy about someone who uses what is deemed to be a bad word in a meeting, and it sort of has cumulative terrible implications for their life. But you never know quite what that word is, and they're never quite sure of why it's fully bad. So just to get that out of the way. But yeah, like the process of it was knowing I'd had like one scene that I'd sort of thrown together, and then from that they were like, oh, this is what the roundabout, we're going to take it around here, go to Edinburgh, we'll go to these places, and there'll be 3 actors, and they'll have to do these other 2 plays as well.
And so you obviously made a decision, 3 actors but not 3 characters, because the doubling is part, I think, is part of the energy in the performance actually, but also a slight sense of, I mean, productive confusion, in the sense that people, you're never all entirely sure who's supposed to be who.
Yeah.
Was that deliberate, and what was that about?
Yeah, it was it's trying to use something that theatre does anyway, which was like multi-rolling. I guess what I really wanted to get at was there is that sense of not ever quite being certain where you are, particularly with language, and particularly where your place is in the culture. And I wanted to kind of replicate that sense of uncertainty. So you'll have these actors, and it'll be the way that play is refracted will depend on the visual, the very obvious visual attributes of those actors that you see. But part of what the play is doing is trying to go, you don't necessarily know who everyone you're seeing is. Like, you think you are because you ascribe the attributes to the actor, to the character.
Yeah.
And then there are like little lines in there that kind of throw that out of whack a little bit. And I really wanted to see that, both that growing sense of confusion for that central character who's like going through this all, but also just to kind of replicate that anxiety that I know like lots of that audience watching will feel, even if they don't admit it. So it was, but to try and make that fun, not to make it a joke on the audience themselves.
Yes, and that's the same with the fact that the characters, the actors all double, but there's also a deliberate. You don't give the characters names. You don't make it clear, even though the whole play is about which groups might be particularly offended by a particular word. You don't specify what social groups anybody might be from. How hard was that to write? Without becoming endlessly abstract, I suppose.
Yeah, especially since I have lots of arguments with people about how specificity is really important in theatre, and how it's really important to me. Not just in terms of inclusion, just in terms of feeling like you're writing those big parts, you're writing those important parts that can sustain a career and a whole generation come after you, etc., etc. I gave all those soapboxy arguments, and then I write this relatively blank play. But I think it's because I think sometimes when people apply blankness to, or that level of unspecificity to something, I think that comes out of a place of reaching for a kind of neutrality. And I have so many thoughts about what neutral is, especially with theatre spaces. And for me, I wanted it to be more about, I wanted to create a sort of a playful thing that a company can come into and shape it a little bit to talk about the thing that concerns them the most. Like, I think this is like the play of mine that's had the most amateur productions, and I find that really interesting in itself, because obviously it's something that people are like, they're interested in, but also the different ways in which that play can be configured. So if you cast, you can create a certain sense of visual confusion depending on who you cast in that central role, and lots of other. And so it asked more of director and the company to be specific in order for the play to say something different. And I've been terrified of that in the past, because I wanted to be very, very clear about what the politics of my work are. And so with this one, you're always asking me, like, is there a white supremacist reading of this play? Like, is there a way you can give us that? And that always is like, God, like, but actually, partly that's the gift of working so quickly, but also rewriting so heavily, because you will when you're writing that fast, and going, actually, I need to give over a lot of this play to the directors, to the actors. I want to be I wanted to be as generous a piece as possible.
Mm.
So part of that blankness was to try and inform the themes of the play, but otherwise it was trying to let it be shaped by the people who are doing it as much as possible.
And the kind of structure of the play, I suppose, or the scene structure of the play is one working week, isn't it? It's Monday to Friday over about 18 scenes, I think. Is that something that feels to me like that could be a decision you took quite early?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, the first draft of that play ends with a sort of, I was like, oh, I want to make it like the Hairy Ape. It just goes like completely nuts, and it ended with the main character in a zoo talking to a puffin who like tells them all their internal thoughts that they've been too terrified to voice. And I was like, this is brilliant, like this is genius. And then obviously that's where I had that conversation where like, I think very, very kind and very confused collaborators like, this like has some interesting energy, can we like shape it into something?
What I wanted to ask you about actually was comedy, because you described it as a dark comedy, which it is, and as I say, it's very funny the whole way through. What are your views about how you write comedy? Presumably there is more to it than just trust that you'll think of funny things.
Yeah. So I think first of all, again, when I was starting writing, I'd run towards the joke more often than not. And it took a lot of discipline for me to go, no, like what's the drama of this scene, and really dig into that. So I think naturally my bent is towards that. Not that necessarily everything I've written would suggest that, which is kind of the reasons I wanted to write this, was to try and flex that part of the muscle. But that part of the muscle, terrible for it. Anyway, it's so just holding on that instinct is hard, because the gratification of a laugh is unlike anything else, especially in theatre. If you manage to, and that sometimes you have to tell the actors like to not reach for the funny thing, like to keep driving the drama of the scene. So in one sense, it's natural, and it's where I lead to in my writing anyway. But I think more often than not, depending on the type of comedy you're writing, it is the act of complicating it in a way which you take the ride is not with the drama, it's following the joke, I think.
Right.
I think, like, for me, or at least that's, to me, the most satisfying stuff. And it depends on the style of comedy that you're doing, but mostly that will come from, you've set up the box of the situation, and then you've thrown in the elements of one person thinks they've like absolutely smashed the meeting, another person's trying to tell them that they've completely effed it up, and you try and find what the tensions between those people are. That will either be, mostly status. That's always like the big fun one, and that has its roots in like the very foundations of comedy. Some of it will be ignorance and expectations, and so I think it is just trying to ask yourself, what is it in this scene that's doing the comedic heavy lifting? Yeah. And I think, again, depending, you can write a piece. So like with that first draft, a lot of the comedic heavy lifting was on, this is just batshit crazy, like what is happening, this is a very surreal image, and the dissonance there creates the laugh. Whereas I realized what I wanted this to be was, it's about holding that tension of the awkwardness within the thing. So we try to angle both the setups and the jokes to be more about that. And you occasionally play with that, so it's not just one type of comedy. But I realized mostly I just wanted it to try and be as excruciating as possible. So yeah, I mean, so in the same way that you'll throw together lots of stuff from a drama and slowly kind of push it together, I think the way that you piece of comedic work together will be to push it more towards that style that you actually try to make the piece be.
And last question. So you've been writing for going on for a decade. What have you learnt? What can you do now that you couldn't do when you started?
This is going to sound like a very weird thing to say, but I think I'm especially on this video collection, I think I'm only now sort of properly a playwright, which is quite nice. And by that I mean I think more fully theatrically now than ever. I feel like I have the license and the right to do that, which has taken a long time for me to get into that headspace. So in that sense, I've learned that I can write plays, which is nice. I think that I've learned that you can be braver with tone than you would think. I think when you're, at least for me, early on, I was like, this is either, quite funny, or this is like a very serious thing. And you use maybe a little bit of comedy to unlock, a little bit of drama or tension, but actually I was trying to be quite rigid. And then actually it is those sweeping divergences of tone, those like car crash juxtapositions, which I find really exciting. And you can do that now. And I think that both is truer to what people are like, but also speaks to the way we experience the world, whether that's on social media or just like, whatever mad event is coming around the corner. And then also I just think I've learned that for me, playwriting will always to an extent be a social enterprise. Like the reason I ended up, I think, in theatre more fully than anything else was because it was being within a community of people. And whether that's, when you're starting out, a bunch of people that you're all broke with and you have no reputation and no status and no fucks. And so you make really exciting stuff together. Like that is really gratifying in a way you don't get in film and telly necessarily, because you can't just put on scratch stuff. Like you have to have made it to a certain degree to make it. And I realised how much I value that community and the work around theatre in particular more than anything else. I think I love how you can make a piece of work the centre of a conversation. And I've learned that for me, that's what theatre's most exciting place is at the centre of a conversation rather than being the whole conversation itself. And what's a practical thing that I've learned? You don't have to be a genius to do the job. You just have to care.
Right. That's a beautiful place to end. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to the point when we can reassemble that community that you just talked about, which of course at the moment is very dispersed. But thank you so much, Vinay. That's so interesting as always. And I look forward to seeing you after lockdown.
See you later. Thanks so much.
Cheers. All right. Bye-bye.